The story I always tell when I used to lecture all over the country to colleges was here I was, a young mental health officer, you know, sitting in my little hooch, counseling my first few weeks there, and a guy comes in that's with an artillery unit, and it's his second tour. And he's telling me, and he just looks like a statue, that he can't go back to his unit anymore. He can't do it anymore. And I said, you can't do what? I mean, you're not out in the field chasing Charlie. You're not, you know, wheeling and dealing and slicing and dicing. You're just there throwing rounds out or whatever. He said, yeah, but they're throwing rounds back, and, you know, I've seen a lot of people killed or whatever. He says, but it's the noise, the concussion. And I said, I just don't get it. Right then and there, a rocket came into our compound and shook our hooch and everything. And I'm under the chair that he's sitting in. He hasn't moved, and I'm just coiled up like a baby pup, shaking. And he turns down and looks at me and says, that's what I'm talking about. I can't take it no more. Psychiatry and counseling in Vietnam was not like anything anybody could imagine. It's not what most people think. You went to a unit and you were basically assigned, in my case, to a MASH hospital where our small unit was. There was one psychiatrist, there was me, a social worker, and we had 3 technicians that did the initial interview as soldiers would be referred down from our area. And we were responsible for about 70,000 troops. Theoretically, 70,000 men primarily could come to the clinic if their commanding officer will allow them for whatever problems they were having. Big if, IF. If someone was really sick and you evaluated, which we did many times, you had to manipulate the system to keep him or him going back to his unit, because the commanding officer, you know, oversimplified it. Send him down the street, get his head on right, send him back up here. Well, here's a guy that had done so much killing and was in what they call then shell shock or whatever, or combat psychosis, and he thinks 3 days with us and Johnny will be okay. And we knew that they were just waiting to get him back so they could put him back in the combat zone or wherever he was. And we'd have to play like, no, we can't. We'd try to hold him. We'd try to evacuate him to Japan. A lot of times the commanding officers were okay with that. A lot of times they fought it and said, no, send him back, and they'd send him back, and then terrible things would happen. The junior officers like myself in a MASH hospital rotate. It was like every 3 weeks you came AOD, which meant after 7 p.m. at night you took over the hospital, and you were in charge for the commander, the colonel, from 7 to 7 in the morning. That 12 hours was yours. And my first time I pull it, we had the largest casualty night of my year. It was 35 injured and killed soldiers coming in at around 9 p.m. at night at dark. And it was probably the most horrifying, shocking 8-10 hours of my life, because it was nonstop. And I was in charge, you know, the blood bank, the surgeons, the operating room. Through all the chaos, you know, you're trying to keep people alive, you're trying to put the dead bodies over here. Sometimes you put the live with the dead and they die, and you make all kinds of mistakes. It's insane. I flew to all the MASH hospitals in other areas where there were problems, race, fraggings, drug problems, racial problems. I mean, everything in 70 was going on that was different than the first few years of the war. You know, everything changed after Tet of '68, and it just went downhill. Well, my tour was right in the middle of the peak of that downhill. I was born in the South, Birmingham, Alabama, in a very Baptist belt country at the time. I was a Catholic kid. There were the Catholic Jews and blacks. We were the minorities. Raised, I would say, lower middle class. Pretty much Catholic missionary country. Went to Catholic grade schools, high schools, and luckily my family, which were second generation immigrants, mother Scotch-Irish, father French-Lebanese, mother from Florida, father from Alabama, where his father settled, coming from Lebanon. He was French-Lebanese. And God only knows where my mother's relatives, they had been here a few generations before my father, but they met, married, moved to Birmingham. The coming home for most Vietnam vets was, if not traumatic, it was dramatic, because several things. One is that we came home not in units. You know, we'd leave our units after making friends, and we came back all strangers on a plane, and then encountering either anger or indifference. Indifference was just as bad. I mean, the silence was deafening. You just didn't exist. You were like invisible. You couldn't wait to get your uniform off. And so you just knew that you had just spent the most incredible, dramatic, dangerous, life-threatening year of your life, and your country could give a shit. And that's your impression you have because you're a young kid. I mean, you can only go by what you see. I had invested the most sensational year. I volunteered to do it. I was a sole surviving son, did not have to go. I did a lot of things and probably had a lot of regrets seeing some of the things that I saw that I didn't, you couldn't read a book about or go to a movie about. So I was very anxious, more anxious going home than I was going to Vietnam. And then everything was going pretty good until we landed in Travis. And as they loaded us on buses to take us to the processing center on this huge base, we saw all this noise and shouting and signs, and then we went in all night to process out. So it was very dramatic, and it was Christmas Eve. And all I want is a hug. I want to see my girl or whatever. And I'm from the South, so I'm landing in Travis, and then we have to bus. So as soon as they start busing us to Oakland to process out, we're met by 300 screaming, raving Berkeley students throwing Molotov cocktails at the bus and screaming and shouting and shaking and attacking the buses. The MPs kind of kept them off of us, and I never forgot that. And then we drove down to Oakland. There was another 300 waiting for us there at the gates. And then we go in, and then you're thinking, man, I mean, this is scary. But I ended up almost being arrested because I hit the airport late Christmas Eve trying to be home for Christmas Day. When I walked into the San Francisco airport, Christmas Eve of '70, there were 3,000 bodies camped on the floor. There were no planes. They had no priority. They had to wait. A lot of them had been there for a week. And 3 black soldiers come up to me. They see my officer's rank. They come up and say, "Sir, they won't let us on the plane because this woman keeps saying we're inebriated." They kept getting bumped because they were drinking beers or whatever. And her fear and her anger towards the war was projected on these men. All they want to do is go home and get, and start getting through these nightmares. So I go over to the counter and I address this woman, and she says, "What do you want?" And I says, "I want these men on the plane." She says, "I'm sorry, but they're inebriated." I said, "Look, they don't even know what that word means. They just want to go home, and they're medicating themselves because you won't let them on the plane." Of course, I over-intellectualized it, but I was angry, and I lost it. And I ended up jumping up on the counter, screaming down on her. And I'm like preaching like a hysterical man. I've never done that in my life. Never done that since. I didn't care. When I came home, all I wanted to do is see my girl and family and get through all of this whole thing seemed like a nightmare. And as soon as I hit home, I knew. They looked at me, and I was different, and I tried to smile through it or whatever, but, I knew they saw something, and I knew something, but I didn't think they saw it, and they saw it. And it was, I didn't fit. I'm different. My girl came up, and I just couldn't sleep. At night, I was up all night, and during the day, I slept. And every time I woke up, I always woke up like I was in Vietnam. I mean, for weeks and weeks and weeks. It just was weird. Everything was strange. Every day, I kept feeling like I'm crazy. And here I am, a mental health professional. And, my hometown shrink is this Irish Catholic man that had a big psychiatric practice in Birmingham, belonged to my parish, offered me a job or whatever. And I'm like, job? I mean, what he was doing sounded like this piddly stuff. I'm sitting here dealing with guys that are dealing with life and death situations. You're dealing with people that are having little anxieties about the fact that their kid's fat or what, I really just overreacted to everything. I was overreacting to everything because I'm all of a sudden, I'm in a place where everything is just, nobody's hurried, nobody's traumatized, nobody can feel this impact that I've had. I'm living it, and it's not necessary, but I can't stop. It's like shaking. I couldn't stop shaking emotionally. And, you know, and then I started, you know, my temper kept going off, and my language, you know, I never cursed in my life, and every word was a 4-letter word. You know, you pick up the war language, and I'm at the table, pass me the fucking this, and, you know, all my family, you know, they've never even heard that word. And finally my dad had to come over, you know, in a very gentle way and say, look, I don't know this language, you know, this or that. And I just, more and more, and then my mother just, you know, was like a little Jewish mother following me around worrying, and I put my fist through the basement door, just leave me alone. And when I did that, and I love my mother, I knew I had to leave.